Hi, my name's Cassidy. I'm 28, living in a little two-bedroom house in Ohio, and I've spent my entire adult life trying to carve out a space that feels like mine. My dad, well, he's dad, has always been the kind of person who makes everything about himself. He calls me late one Wednesday night, and I should have known from the first note of his laughter that something was off. I picked up the phone, trying to mask the unease curling in my stomach. I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if you want more real-life stories about family drama, emotional courage, and moments that change lives, don't forget to subscribe and join our community. You won't want to miss what happens next. Cassidy, guess what? This Christmas is going to be perfect. He practically shouted through the line, the sound of his booming voice bouncing off the walls of my small living room. I've got a plan. 30 people, all of us together at your house. I froze. My hand hovered over the coffee cup I'd been sipping. 30? 30 people. At my house. My quiet, modest, carefully curated space that I had spent months cleaning, organizing, and making my own. My father, in his typical fashion, hadn't even asked. He just assumed it. Dad, wait, 30 people? I started, my voice trailing, disbelief cutting through every word. Yep, he interrupted, beaming. Your place is perfect for it. Everyone's excited. Your Aunt Martha, Uncle Jim, all the cousins, they can't wait. I felt a cold wave of tension roll over me. I could hear him laughing, imagining the joy, completely unaware or uncaring of the fact that he had just obliterated my plans, my peace, and my home. I could practically see the faces of his relatives, the way they would move through my living room, leaving crumbs and footprints, chatting loudly over the faint hum of my heater, turning my private space into a public hall. Dad, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I don't know if I can even fit that many people here. My kitchen, my whole house, is really small. He chuckled, dismissing my concern like it was a minor inconvenience, a mere detail in the grand performance of his family Christmas. Don't worry about that, Cass. You're hosting, so you get to shine. We'll all pitch in. Everyone will be thrilled. You're the hostess with the mostest. I set down my coffee, feeling the warmth seep out as my mind raced. This wasn't just about space. It was about being used. Again, every year, he found a way to involve me in these elaborate family gatherings, expecting me to absorb the stress, manage the chaos, and make it look effortless. And every year, he took the credit. Every year, my contribution was invisible. I glanced around my living room, the beige walls adorned with a few framed photos and modest decorations. My couch, small but cozy, would be completely inadequate for this crowd. My dining table could barely seat 6 comfortably. I had bought this home to have a space of my own, to finally feel independent. And now, Dad had turned it into a staging ground for his ego and his relatives' delight. As I sank into the sofa, I could hear the familiar hum of my refrigerator, the subtle ticking of the clock, and the quiet that I had cherished for months. And suddenly, that quiet felt suffocating because it was about to be shattered by a tidal wave of 30 people who didn't care whose space they were taking. I closed my eyes for a moment and tried to calm my breathing. I could still hear him talking, oblivious. It's going to be magical, Cass. You'll see. Everyone will remember this Christmas forever. Magical. That word struck me sharply because it wasn't about magic. It was about control, about entitlement, about his need to orchestrate and dominate every family event, regardless of my feelings. Dad, I said more firmly this time, trying to make him understand, you didn't even ask me if I wanted this. My house. This is my home, not some hotel for your relatives. He paused for a second, a flicker of hesitation, but quickly recovered. Cass, relax. Don't be dramatic. It's Christmas. Everyone's family. You love us, right? You'll do it because it's for the family. Yes. The classic guilt trip. That line always worked. But not tonight. Not this time. Because as I listened, I felt a growing sense of rebellion inside me, sharp and clear. I was done being quietly swept aside. I hung up the phone and sat back, letting the silence of my house wrap around me. I thought about the years I'd spent trying to please him, trying to fit into his ideal of family obedience. And I felt a surge of both sadness and anger. I thought of last Christmas, when I had stayed up until midnight preparing a meal for 20 relatives, only for him to stand at the head of the table and announce to everyone how wonderful it all was, without a single mention of my efforts. My gaze drifted to the little Christmas tree in the corner. Its lights twinkled softly, almost mockingly, as if reminding me that the joy of the season had nothing to do with me, but everything to do with him. I remembered the boxes of decorations I'd painstakingly unpacked, the homemade cookies I had baked, the careful planning to make everyone feel welcomed. And now he expected me to repeat it for an even bigger, more chaotic gathering. The thought of 30 people, all talking at once, all expecting me to smile, cook, clean, and entertain. It was overwhelming. My chest tightened. I felt trapped in my own home. And then, as the tension coiled in my stomach, I noticed something else, my own agency. I had a choice. For the first time in a long while, I realized that I didn't have to comply, that my home didn't belong to anyone but me. I made myself a cup of tea, my hands trembling slightly. I sat by the window, watching the snow start to fall gently outside, each flake dissolving into the darkness of the street. And in that quiet moment, I started thinking of possibilities, ways to assert myself, ways to reclaim my space, ways to make him understand that I was not his property, not his servant, not his tool for holiday theatrics. I could almost hear the distant, imagined voices of his relatives, laughing, planning, oblivious to the discomfort they would bring. And in that imagined chaos, a small, defiant smile crossed my face. I decided I would not allow myself to be overwhelmed or erased this time. I wasn't sure exactly what I would do yet, but I knew something had to change. For years, I had swallowed my resentment, hidden my discomfort, and smiled through the exhaustion and emotional weight. But tonight, that cycle broke. I picked up my phone again and stared at the contact labeled Dad. I debated calling back, telling him no, arguing, pleading, but I knew his charm and guilt tactics would win, as they always did. I didn't want to argue. I didn't want to negotiate. I wanted action. I wanted control. I wanted my home to be mine. I turned off my phone, feeling a strange mix of liberation and anxiety. My mind raced through all the logistics he expected me to manage, sleeping arrangements, food, decorations, seating, and the endless small details that no one else would notice or appreciate. Each task felt heavier than the last, each expectation another invisible weight pressing down on my shoulders. And yet, for the first time in years, I didn't feel powerless. I felt a spark, small, cautious, but real. A spark that whispered maybe, just maybe, I could do something entirely unexpected. Something that would finally make him see me, or at least make him stop taking me for granted. I went to the kitchen, mechanically stirring my tea, and noticed the small stack of Christmas cards from last year, many with little notes from relatives thanking me for hosting. I realized with a pang that they didn't know me, they didn't know the hours of work, the emotional energy, the small compromises I had made to keep the peace. They only knew the final picture he presented. A perfect family gathering, orchestrated by my labor, credited to him. The unfairness of it all made me ache, but it also steeled me. I wasn't going to be invisible anymore. I didn't need to prove myself to them. I didn't need to be the silent, smiling backdrop to his holiday drama. As the night deepened, I walked through my living room slowly, taking in the familiar sight of my modest furniture, the soft rug under my feet, the small Christmas tree standing proudly in the corner. I realized that every inch of this space was mine, and that realization ignited a plan I couldn't yet fully articulate, but one that I knew would mark a turning point. I made myself a promise, quietly and firmly. This year, things would be different. If 30 people were coming to my house, they wouldn't find the same Cassidy who had spent years quietly accommodating, smiling through frustration, and putting everyone else's comfort above her own. I sat by the window for what felt like hours, watching the snow fall, sipping my tea, and letting the magnitude of Dad's announcement sink in. 30 people. My house. My responsibility. But also potentially my chance to finally assert control in a situation that had always been dictated by others. I didn't know how it would play out. I didn't know if I would argue, run, or confront. But for the first time, I felt the clarity of my own power. And in that clarity, the first hints of a plan began to form. One that would ensure this Christmas would be remembered, but not for the reasons Dad expected. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a deep, measured breath. Outside, the snow continued to fall silently, covering the streets in white, peaceful, and untouched. Inside, my home felt smaller and more precious than ever. I was ready to protect it, no matter what it took. And as I finally set my tea down and moved toward my bedroom, I couldn't help but whisper to myself, almost like a warning. They think this house is theirs for the taking, but they have no idea what's coming. The snow outside had settled into a soft, muffled quiet, blanketing the street in white, as if the world itself had paused to watch what would unfold in my little house. I could still hear faint creaks in the floorboards, the subtle hum of the furnace, and the distant tick of the clock. Each sound reminded me that my home, my sanctuary, was about to be transformed into something I didn't want, a staging ground for 30 people, orchestrated entirely by my father. I stood in the middle of the living room, scanning the space with a mixture of disbelief and disbelief turned into dread. My 2 couches, arranged for intimacy and comfort, looked laughably inadequate for the crowd I was about to host. The coffee table, cluttered with books, a laptop, and my favorite mug suddenly seemed like a tiny island in a sea of chaos I could barely imagine. I felt my chest tighten, a wave of tension pushing me to the edge. 30 people, my kitchen, my bathroom, my space. And somehow I was supposed to make it all feel welcoming and perfect. I opened my kitchen cabinets, counting plates, cups, and bowls, trying to calculate in my head if I had enough for everyone. 30 sets. I didn't even have that many chairs. My fridge groaned in complaint as I imagined the avalanche of groceries, snacks, and drinks my dad's relatives would expect me to supply. The thought made my stomach churn. I couldn't recall ever feeling so small in my own home, so diminished by someone else's assumptions. I picked up my phone and called my best friend, Jenna, hoping for a dose of sanity. "Jenna, it's Dad," I muttered, my voice tight. He just decided 30 people are coming to my house for Christmas. No discussion, no asking me. 30 people. There was a long pause on the other end, then her incredulous laugh. 30? Cassidy, are you kidding me? How big is your house again? Exactly, I said, pacing the kitchen. It's a 2-bedroom apartment. 2 bedrooms. I don't even know where they're all going to sleep. I mean, my living room? The dining room? There's no space. Cass, breathe, Jenna said softly, though I could hear the concern in her voice. You don't have to figure this out alone. You can say no. I mean, come on, this is ridiculous. Your dad can't just assume. I sank onto the kitchen stool, pressing my palms to my face. Jenna was right, logically, but logic felt fragile next to the flood of guilt and obligation that had been drilled into me since childhood. Saying no wasn't just refusing. It felt like a betrayal, a fracture in a family that had always used love as a weapon to manipulate me. And yet, a spark flickered. Maybe this time I could hold my ground. I spent the next hour walking through my house, notebook in hand, scribbling lists, and drawing rough floor plans. I measured space, calculated seating, and tried to envision how 30 people could move without stepping on each other. I felt a creeping sense of absurdity. 30 people. At my house. On a snow-covered Christmas. I could practically hear Dad's voice, cheerful and dismissive. "It'll be magical. Everyone will love it." My eyes fell on my small Christmas tree again, its lights casting soft shadows on the walls. I had bought it months ago, imagining quiet evenings with hot cocoa, reading by the twinkling lights, maybe inviting 1 or 2 friends over. Not this. Not a 30-person invasion, where I would vanish beneath demands and expectations. The tree, delicate and personal, seemed to mock me. I started tackling small preparations mechanically, wiping the dust from the shelves, vacuuming, organizing the couch cushions. But even these simple tasks felt overwhelming because I knew they would barely make a dent in the chaos to come. Each movement reminded me that I was preparing for people who hadn't even asked for my input, people who saw me as a facilitator of their comfort, not as an individual with feelings. At one point, I noticed a small incident that seemed almost symbolic. My cat, Whiskers, jumped onto the countertop, knocking over a cup of pens. Ink spilled across the counter, and I sighed heavily, bending down to clean it. Whiskers meowed, looking at me with those wide, innocent eyes as if sensing my frustration. I realized in that moment that even my little routines, my own small order, were being disrupted before the real storm had even arrived. I tried to talk to Dad that evening, calling him again. "Dad, we need to discuss the setup," I said carefully, trying to sound reasonable. "I can't fit 30 people here. There's no room, and He interrupted with a laugh. "Cass, don't worry so much. You're overthinking. It'll be fun. A little tight, sure, but that's part of the charm. You'll see. Everyone's excited." I pressed on, frustration rising. "Dad, it's not just about fun. It's about logistics. Sleeping arrangements, food, seating. I don't even have enough chairs. And the kitchen is tiny." "Cassidy," he said, his tone light, brushing aside my concerns, "you worry too much. Just trust me. You'll handle it. You always do." There it was. That familiar line. "You always do." As if I had no choice, no opinion, no voice. My throat tightened, and I sank onto the couch, feeling the weight of years pressing down. But beneath the irritation, a quiet determination began to grow. This time would be different. I spent the next few hours making lists, but my mind kept wandering to the dynamics that would unfold. Aunt Martha, with her sharp tongue and critical eye. Uncle Jim, always boasting about his achievements while ignoring mine. Cousins who had been spoiled and entitled since birth. Each name brought a twinge of anxiety. And yet, it was oddly exhilarating to imagine a scenario where I had the power to assert myself. I took a moment to look outside. The street was empty, the snow still falling softly, covering footprints and tire tracks alike. I imagined the relatives arriving tomorrow, shuffling through my driveway, carrying bags and gifts, chattering and laughing. And I imagined myself, somewhere in the chaos, holding a secret plan that they couldn't anticipate. Dinner preparations became the next focus. I opened my fridge, surveying the small stock I had. A few vegetables, some frozen meat, and barely enough condiments to feed more than a handful of people. 30 people. The thought made me grimace. I started jotting down shopping lists, realizing with a sinking heart that I would have to run errands for hours in the coming days if I chose to comply. And yet, a small, defiant part of me wondered if this was exactly the right moment to reconsider my options entirely. As evening fell, I moved to organize the living room, imagining how people would navigate the furniture. I tried different arrangements, stacking chairs in corners, pulling out extra cushions, and measuring walking paths with my feet. Each adjustment made me feel slightly more in control, though I knew it would barely prepare me for 30 personalities converging in this small space. At one point, I discovered a minor but telling sign of my father's mindset. He had left a note on the fridge: "Don't stress, Cass. It'll all be great." The handwriting was cheerful, casual, almost naive, but it stung. It reminded me that he believed my house existed not as a home for me, but as a backdrop for his vision of Christmas. I sank back onto the couch, letting my head rest against the cushions. My heart raced, not just from the logistics, but from the realization that I was facing a crossroads. I could comply, bending myself to his expectations once again, or I could assert some measure of control, something small, strategic, and unexpected. My mind drifted to the possibility of walking away entirely, of reclaiming my space, even if only for a little while. The sound of my phone buzzing startled me. It was a group text from Dad's side of the family, innocuous enough. "Can't wait for Christmas at Cassidy's. Who's bringing the cookies?" My stomach sank. They didn't see me. They didn't consider me. I was just the host, the space, the facilitator. I took a deep breath, letting the sting of invisibility settle into a simmering awareness. By late night, I found myself moving almost automatically, cleaning countertops, dusting surfaces, checking light bulbs, and rearranging furniture for maximum efficiency. Each task felt like both a preparation and a rehearsal, a way to mentally brace for the storm that was coming. And with every scrubbed counter and swept floor, my resentment simmered quietly alongside the determination that this time something would be different. Finally, exhausted, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the snow fall in silence. I imagined the chaos of tomorrow, each laugh, each argument, each expectation, and I allowed myself a small, private smile. For the first time, I realized that preparation didn't have to mean submission. It could mean strategy. It could mean control, subtle and precise. I didn't know exactly what I would do yet, but I knew this: I would not be invisible this year. I would not be taken for granted. And if 30 people arrived at my home tomorrow, they would find a Cassidy who was ready, alert, and unafraid to assert herself. The house was eerily quiet after I finished my last round of tidying and rearranging. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, leaving the street glittering under the pale glow of streetlights. It looked peaceful, serene even, but inside, I felt nothing but the electric tension of anticipation. Tomorrow, 30 people would descend on my small, modest home, and I was meant to make everything perfect. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on me, and yet beneath it, a growing, stubborn spark of defiance flickered. I sank into the couch, my hands wrapped tightly around a steaming cup of tea. I tried to steady my racing thoughts, but they bounced from one worry to another. Where would everyone sleep? Would Aunt Martha comment on my shabby couch covers? Would Uncle Jim criticize the food I had? What about my small kitchen? Would there be enough room to cook without chaos breaking out? Every question seemed to breed a dozen more, each one clawing at my nerves like an endless tide. I glanced around the living room, noticing the faint gleam of the Christmas tree lights reflecting on the walls. My carefully chosen ornaments twinkled gently, their soft colors muted by the dim glow of the streetlight outside. The tree looked almost fragile now, as if it could shatter under the weight of 30 people tramping through the room. I reached out to straighten a bent ornament, my fingers lingering on the cool glass. Every small adjustment, every tiny act of order felt like a small act of rebellion, a way to reclaim a fragment of control before chaos arrived. I tried calling Dad one more time to clarify details, but he didn't answer. probably already asleep or too caught up in imagining how thrilled everyone would be. I left a message, careful to keep my tone light but firm. Dad, I'm going to need help tomorrow. 30 people are a lot for my house, and I can't do it alone. Please call me back as soon as you can. After hanging up, I sat back and closed my eyes, letting the silence envelope me. But quiet didn't mean calm. My mind replayed past Christmases with Dad's relatives, memories of feeling invisible, overworked, and emotionally drained. I remembered the year my cousin Lisa had spilled grape juice all over the rug and laughed while Dad scolded me for not watching her. I remembered the passive-aggressive comments about my furniture, my cooking, my small, unworthy house, and the guilt. Oh, the guilt I had carried for years, pretending it wasn't there. I took a deep breath and focused on the present. This night could be different. I could take ownership in ways I had never dared. I could prepare, not just for survival, but to quietly assert myself in ways no one would expect. My hand went back to the notebook I had used the previous night. I reviewed my lists, seating arrangements, food inventory, decorations, and potential sleeping setups. Each line was a lifeline, a structure amidst the chaos I could almost hear approaching. The phone buzzed again. A text from Jenna. Cassidy, are you still awake? You sound stressed. Are you sure you're okay? I typed back slowly, trying to plan. 30 people tomorrow. It's a lot. I know. Don't let them overwhelm you, she replied almost instantly. Remember, you have a right to boundaries. I set the phone aside and let her words settle. Boundaries. Something I had rarely enforced with Dad, but now, as the night stretched on and the clock ticked toward the early hours, the concept felt like a small shield against the storm. I could prepare. Yes, but I didn't have to allow myself to be swept away by expectations or guilt. I decided to check on the kitchen one last time. I opened the fridge and surveyed the contents. A modest stock of vegetables, a few frozen meats, some leftovers from earlier in the week. I pulled out containers, rearranging them to make space, stacking items neatly so that tomorrow I could find what I needed without panic. My mind raced through the meals I could cook quickly if pressed, making mental notes of substitutions and shortcuts. I could almost imagine the clattering of pots, the smell of roasted vegetables and baked ham filling the air, but my imagination also whispered possibilities of refusing to engage entirely, leaving some things undone, letting Dad experience just a fraction of the chaos he had assumed would be invisible to him. As I worked, I noticed Whiskers pawing at the curtain, staring intently at something outside. I went to the window and saw a lone car passing by on the snow-slicked street. The sight reminded me of how isolated my little home was in the quiet of the night, and in that isolation, I felt both vulnerability and power. Tomorrow, 30 people would arrive, but tonight it was only me, the cat, and the stillness. And tonight, I could plan. Tonight, I could reclaim a little control before the storm hit. I moved on to preparing extra sleeping spaces, a small but crucial task. I pulled out my inflatable mattress and laid it in the living room, stacking blankets and pillows. I imagined Cousin Ella sprawled across it, complaining about comfort, and felt a flicker of amusement. The thought made me realize I could use anticipation and preparation as a form of subtle rebellion, doing the bare minimum in ways that highlighted the absurdity of the expectation, rather than succumbing silently to it. By 11 p.m., I felt a combination of exhaustion and tension that twisted my stomach. I had cleaned, rearranged, measured, listed, and calculated, but nothing could fully prepare me for the personalities and egos that would descend on my space tomorrow. I paced the living room, glancing at the notes I had scrawled in my notebook, rehearsing responses to potential criticisms, imagining interactions, and even small confrontations. Each imagined exchange made my pulse race, but it also reinforced my growing confidence that I didn't have to be a passive participant. I decided to test out the furniture layout one last time, moving chairs and sofas in tentative configurations. The act of physical preparation helped soothe the mental storm. I could visualize the flow of movement, the placement of food, and even the lines where people would congregate. It was like mapping a battlefield, except my strategy was control, not conflict. And yet, despite these practical actions, emotional turbulence kept rising. I thought about Dad again, imagining him explaining the plan to his relatives, predicting their delight, completely unaware of the tension simmering in my chest. I imagined the group messages, the casual jokes, the expectations of perfection. I felt anger, but also a strange sort of anticipation. What if tomorrow's storm could become a mirror for them, a reflection of the disruption they assumed they could impose without consequence? I checked my phone again. No new calls, just a flurry of texts from cousins and aunts, their messages full of cheerful emojis and casual planning. Can't wait for Christmas at Cassidy's. Who's bringing the pie? Let's make it magical. Each notification felt like a pinprick to my patience. I replied minimally, offering logistical confirmations, but not giving away my feelings. It was an act of silent resistance. Engagement without surrender. At 1 a.m., I finally allowed myself a pause. I curled up on the couch with Whiskers nestled beside me, sipping a small cup of tea I had reheated. The heat seeped through my fingers, grounding me. I let my gaze drift to the Christmas tree, its light soft and steady. I realized that tomorrow's storm, for all its chaos, could be a canvas for asserting boundaries, for quietly claiming power in subtle ways that no one expected. A sudden sound made me jump, my neighbor's dog barking at a distant noise. My heart raced, and I realized how keyed up I had become, every nerve taut with tension and anticipation. I rubbed my face, trying to slow my heartbeat. It was only the night, only the quiet, only my imagination amplifying the stakes. But even as I calmed, the anxiety didn't dissipate entirely. It was a constant undertone, a reminder that the arrival of 30 people would transform my home into a place I might not recognize. I decided to make a small snack before bed. I cut some cheese and crackers, arranging them neatly on a plate. As I did, I noticed the faint scuff marks on my countertop from previous hurried preparations, reminders of past effort and unseen labor. I felt a pang of irritation at how my space had been taken for granted repeatedly over the years. I almost laughed quietly at the absurdity of preparing snacks at 2 a.m., but I resisted. Humor felt inappropriate. This was a rehearsal, a mental and physical preparation for the storm ahead. Finally, around 2:30 a.m., I forced myself to sit down with my notebook one last time. I reviewed the lists, ticking off items I had completed and noting potential problems. Every task, no matter how small, felt like a step toward reclaiming a sense of agency. I imagined the looks on faces tomorrow when they saw the setup, not perfect in Dad's imagined way, but functional, organized, and prepared in ways they had not anticipated. The more I planned, the more I realized that control could be mine in subtle ways. I didn't have to confront anyone directly. I didn't have to argue or yell. I could shape the environment, anticipate challenges, and assert boundaries silently, almost invisibly, leaving them to navigate a scenario they assumed I would handle effortlessly. That realization settled like a stone of calm in my chest amidst the storm of anticipation. As 3 a.m. approached, I finally laid down in my bedroom. Whiskers leapt onto the bed, curling at my feet. I wrapped the blankets around me and stared at the ceiling, letting exhaustion wash over my body. Tomorrow would be a test, not of my endurance alone, but of the balance between assertion and restraint. I didn't know exactly how it would play out, but for the first time, I felt a sense of preparation that extended beyond the physical. I was ready mentally and emotionally, bracing for the storm with a new strategy: quiet control, observation, and subtle power. Sleep eventually claimed me, fragmented and light, as if even my subconscious knew that the night before a tidal wave of 30 people could never be truly peaceful. Yet beneath the anxiety, I carried a thread of hope, a belief that I could navigate this chaos on my terms, even if only in small, precise ways. And as dreams drifted in, they carried visions of tomorrow's arrivals, each moment unfolding in slow motion, giving me the sense that I could see the storm before it hit, and maybe, just maybe, direct it in ways that no one else could anticipate. I woke before dawn, the dim glow of early morning filtering through my bedroom curtains. The house was still, almost painfully quiet, except for the rhythmic hum of the heater and the faint stirrings of Whiskers, who had claimed the foot of my bed as his territory. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the events of the past 2 days, the lists, the preparations, the arguments, the mental rehearsals, and I knew with a certainty that had never been so clear before: I could not host 30 people. Not tomorrow. Not under these conditions. I slid out of bed carefully, trying not to wake Whiskers. My movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic, as if performing them with precision could ensure that no one else would interfere. The plan I had been nurturing in secret for days was about to be executed. I had rehearsed it mentally, envisioned each step, anticipated Dad's response. And now the moment had arrived. The first step was simple in theory, complicated in practice. I had to leave no trace of panic, no overt sign that I was about to vanish. I dressed quickly, pulling on a warm sweater and jeans, and tiptoed to the kitchen. I prepared a small breakfast for myself, just a cup of tea and a slice of toast, because even a tiny ritual of normalcy would help anchor me as I moved into unfamiliar territory. I ate silently, listening to the quiet house, feeling the weight of anticipation press against my chest. Next, I packed an overnight bag, carefully selecting items I would need for the immediate future: clothes, toiletries, a journal, and a few personal items that carried the comfort of familiarity. I added a small emergency kit, bandages, water, snacks, because instinct had taught me that control was in preparation, not in improvisation. Each item placed in the bag felt like a symbolic act, a reclaiming of space that was mine, separate from the chaos that would soon arrive. Before leaving, I paused in the living room, glancing at the Christmas tree. The lights twinkled softly, casting delicate shadows on the walls. It was the same tree I had decorated days ago with care, and now it stood as both a witness and a challenge. I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile. Tomorrow it would still be lit, but I would not be there to oversee the spectacle. I would not be the invisible labor, the facilitator of someone else's joy. Tomorrow, I would exist on my terms. I left a note on the kitchen counter, brief but deliberate. I needed to step away for a while. I will be back. Please take care of yourselves and each other. I avoided any hint of blame or drama. I wanted the message to carry quiet authority, to unsettle without inflaming. It was a subtle act of defiance, a way to communicate without confrontation, to assert control while remaining unseen. Walking toward the door, I felt a surge of nervous energy. Each step toward freedom was tempered by a pang of guilt, an echo of years spent trying to please a family that never fully acknowledged my effort. I hesitated at the doorknob, feeling the cold metal under my fingers, then exhaled and turned it. The door opened smoothly, and the crisp winter air greeted me like an ally, carrying the scent of snow and pine. It was cold, invigorating, and cleansing, a promise of autonomy just beyond the threshold of my home. I stepped outside, closing the door quietly behind me. The snow crunched under my boots, each step a reminder that I was moving away from expectation and toward self-determination. I paused for a moment, looking back at the house, imagining Dad arriving to find it empty, imagining the relatives' arrival and the confusion that would ripple through their carefully planned holiday. The thought made a small, private smile spread across my face. I didn't have far to go. I walked to a nearby roadside motel I had checked into earlier that day under a discreet reservation. Each step felt surreal, as if I were moving through a dream where normal rules didn't apply. My heart pounded, a mix of exhilaration and anxiety, and with every step, the reality of what I was doing settled deeper into me. I was disappearing, not running away in fear, but asserting a boundary that years of subservience had never allowed me to claim. At the motel, I settled into a small room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and fabric softener. I laid out my bag, arranging items meticulously, finding comfort in the act of organization. It was a temporary sanctuary, a place where I could breathe, reflect, and plan the next steps without interference. I sat by the window, staring at the snow-covered parking lot, watching the faint headlights of passing cars, and imagining Dad pacing through my living room, realizing that control was slipping from his grasp. Back at my house, Dad's morning began with confusion. I had timed my disappearance carefully. The note was vague, leaving him to process my absence without immediate guidance. He entered the kitchen, coffee mug in hand, humming lightly, expecting me to greet him with enthusiasm and reassurance. Instead, he found the note, neatly written, the ink fresh. His brow furrowed as he read it. "Cassidy," he muttered aloud, disbelief creeping into his voice. He checked the living room, the bedrooms, the small bathroom. The house was empty, silent, organized, yet devoid of the person who had orchestrated its upkeep for weeks. He called my name again, louder this time, a mixture of confusion and mounting frustration coloring each syllable. Meanwhile, I lay in the motel room, my phone vibrating softly. Messages from Dad began to appear, one after another, increasing in intensity. "Cassidy, where are you? Cassidy, I don't understand. Cassidy, this isn't funny." Each ping made my stomach knot, but I refused to respond. The silence on my end was part of the plan, part of the lesson I intended to teach without confrontation, without shouting, without drama. I watched the messages and allowed myself a strange, guilty satisfaction. For once, my absence had weight. My presence had always been taken for granted, invisible labor credited to others. Now, the very act of not being there had authority. It made me feel alive in a way that years of passive compliance never had. I imagined the relatives arriving shortly, their laughter and chatter carrying through the quiet neighborhood. I could picture Aunt Martha opening the front door, her eyes scanning the empty living room, realizing that nothing had been left as a welcoming gesture. Uncle Jim would mutter complaints under his breath, the cousins exchanging confused looks. Dad, for the first time, would confront the consequences of assuming I was an extension of his plans rather than a person with agency. I paced the motel room, my thoughts spinning. Part of me felt the pull of guilt. This was family, after all, but another part, stronger and steadier, reminded me that self-respect was not a betrayal. It was an assertion, a necessary act of preservation. I had spent decades bending to expectations, hiding my feelings, and performing gratitude for opportunities one had not chosen. This was the first Christmas I had taken for myself, even if it meant being physically absent. I imagined my home transformed by absence. The meticulously arranged furniture I had set the night before would remain undisturbed for a few hours, giving Dad and the relatives an illusion of order before chaos inevitably seeped in. I pictured the tension rising, the subtle panic as they realized that someone had to coordinate, to cook, to manage, and that someone was not me. At one point, I allowed myself a brief walk around the motel parking lot. The cold air bit at my cheeks, the crunch of snow underfoot grounding me in reality. I let my thoughts drift, considering every potential scenario. Dad trying to fix things, relatives arguing over seating, minor disasters unfolding. I couldn't help but feel a small thrill at the thought that, for once, I would be the observer, not the participant. Returning to my room, I opened my journal and began writing. I documented the feelings swirling inside me: fear, relief, defiance, anticipation. Each word solidified my sense of self, a reminder that this act was not selfish in a destructive way, but necessary. I was claiming autonomy, practicing courage, and testing boundaries I had never dared to enforce. The morning hours passed slowly. The tension was thick, almost tangible, pressing against me with every passing minute. I drank tea, reviewed my plans, and let my mind roam over small details: how I would respond to messages, how I would maintain silence while remaining safe, how I would observe the unfolding events without interference. Each thought reinforced my strategy, each imagined reaction from Dad and his relatives strengthened my resolve. By late morning, the distant sounds of engines and footsteps reached my ears. I peeked through the curtains, seeing cars slowly arrive in front of my house. My pulse quickened. The storm I had anticipated was beginning. I could hear faint voices, laughter, shouts, and the occasional clatter of bags being set down. Dad's familiar voice rose above the rest, attempting cheerfulness, masking a note of irritation that only made my satisfaction grow. I sank back into the motel chair, Whiskers perched on my lap, purring softly. I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. I was present, yet absent, observing, yet safe. The vanishing act, the culmination of days of preparation, calculation, and emotional fortitude, was underway, and for the first time in years, I felt completely, undeniably in control. I watched from the corner of the motel room, a small, quiet observer of the chaos I had deliberately left behind. The snow outside had begun to melt slightly in the weak winter sunlight, droplets sliding slowly down the glass of the window. I could hear faint shouts, laughter, and the low hum of frantic conversations drifting up from my house across the street. For the first time in years, I felt completely detached from the expectation and demands that had weighed on me like chains. The vanishing act I had executed the night before was unfolding perfectly. Dad, who had always relied on me to silently manage the details of every holiday gathering, was floundering visibly. I could see him pacing in the living room through the thin veil of the motel curtains, gesturing wildly as he attempted to coordinate people who were already trying to carve their own paths through the house. Aunt Martha, my usual tormentor, had her arms crossed tightly, tapping her foot, casting thinly veiled disapproving glances at Dad, as if he were solely responsible for what she perceived as a failure. Uncle Jim muttered under his breath, holding a half-empty bag of groceries, shaking his head in disbelief. A strange sense of satisfaction crept through me, not malicious, not triumphant in a cruel sense, but quiet and potent. For years, I had bent to make everyone else comfortable, absorbed their needs, and smoothed over their complaints. And now, in my absence, they were forced to experience the tiniest fraction of the disorientation I had endured countless times. I smiled faintly, taking slow, deliberate breaths, allowing the calm to sink into my chest. It was an unusual silence for me, not the physical quiet, but the internal one. Normally, I would be bustling around the kitchen, arranging food, refilling drinks, apologizing for space limitations, or taking on the emotional labor of soothing grievances. Now, I was silent, observing, and in that silence lay a kind of power I hadn't realized I possessed. I realized that my presence had always been undervalued, taken as a default. The act of stepping away had given me a voice without uttering a single word. Through the window, I could see the relatives attempting to navigate the living room. Chairs were pulled from corners, cushions rearranged, snacks moved around, and yet there was a palpable tension in the air. The house felt lived in, but disorganized, and their discomfort was tangible. They had expected ease, effortless hosting, and quiet compliance, but instead, they were confronted with a small dose of reality. I watched Uncle Jim trip over a blanket left carelessly on the floor, muttering curses under his breath, while Cousin Ella complained that there was nowhere to sit. The subtle, domino-like effect of my absence was unfolding naturally without intervention. Dad's face was a mix of confusion, frustration, and reluctant admiration. He moved from room to room, trying to organize, trying to manage, trying to reclaim control, and failing. The sight of him flustered, his carefully maintained composure cracked, stirred something deep in me. I had loved him, respected him, and yes, feared him, but witnessing him operate outside of his usual control reminded me of the inherent human fragility behind authority. Power was often a mask, and now the mask was slipping. While I observed, I allowed myself to reflect on what this experience meant. It wasn't revenge, not really. It was self-respect, the assertion of boundaries that had been ignored or dismissed for too long. For years, I had felt guilty for wanting space, for prioritizing myself, for desiring moments of peace during events that were ostensibly about family celebration. And now, in the quiet observation of others struggling, I could appreciate the clarity and validation of my own needs. I sipped my tea slowly, the warmth grounding me as I continued to watch. I noticed small incidents. Aunt Martha scolding Cousin Tim for spilling a cup, Dad apologizing for a broken chair that hadn't even been his fault, a cousin complaining about the lack of dessert. These incidents, mundane and ordinary, were magnified in my absence, and through them I recognized an essential truth. I had been carrying invisible labor for years, labor that went unacknowledged. The vanishing act had illuminated that reality without confrontation. As the morning wore on, I began to notice subtle shifts in the household energy. Voices grew a little softer as Dad attempted to organize breakfast. Cousins, initially annoyed, began negotiating with each other, finding their own solutions. Aunt Martha grumbled less, observing that the toaster was still functional and that perhaps she could manage a small batch of toast herself. The chaos, in its own imperfect way, began to settle into a new rhythm, one that did not rely on me, one that functioned despite my absence. I felt a strange pride, mingled with an unexpected sense of melancholy. Pride that I had asserted myself. Yes, but melancholy for all the years I had been invisible in situations that required my effort. I realized that boundaries are not just about saying no, they are about self-awareness, respect, and understanding your own value. And in the stillness of my motel room, I could finally see that clearly. Dad's eventual phone call came mid-morning. He sounded flustered, hesitant, and oddly vulnerable, traits I rarely heard in his voice. "Cassidy, you didn't have to. I didn't know you'd just leave like this." I exhaled, savoring the calm I could maintain, even as he spoke. "Dad, I needed space," I said softly, deliberately measured. "I've always managed too much, and this time, I needed to step away for myself." There was silence on the line, a pause long enough for me to feel the gravity of my words settle. I understand," he admitted finally. "I guess I didn't realize how much I rely on you, or how often I take it for granted." I let the silence linger. There was no argument, no justifications, just acknowledgement. That acknowledgement was enough. More than enough. It was the first time I had felt truly seen by him in a way that didn't require perfection or compliance. I hung up and returned to the window, watching the subtle transformations in my home. People were beginning to cooperate, finding a rhythm without my intervention. Dad was moving less frantically, asking for opinions rather than dictating. I realized with a quiet satisfaction that the chaos was manageable even without me there. The storm I had feared was not insurmountable. It merely required perspective. Throughout the afternoon, I reflected on the lessons I was learning. Silence, I realized, had power, not in a manipulative sense, but as a form of self-preservation and clarity. By removing myself from the immediate environment, I had given space for both observation and insight. I had allowed my family to encounter the realities of independence and responsibility, and in doing so, I had reinforced my own self-worth. By evening, I allowed myself a walk outside, stretching my legs and feeling the cold air against my skin. The quiet streets reflected back a sense of serenity I hadn't experienced in years. Each step reminded me that I had agency, that my choices mattered, and that asserting boundaries, even in subtle ways, was not betrayal but affirmation of self-respect. When I returned to the motel room, I checked my phone again. Messages from Dad were calmer now, tinged with appreciation rather than panic. "We're figuring it out." One read. Another said, "I think we needed this perspective. Thank you for helping us realize something important." I smiled, recognizing that sometimes teaching lessons requires stepping back rather than stepping in. The night drew close, and I reflected on the day's events with a sense of quiet triumph. The relatives were still at my house, navigating challenges I had once absorbed silently. Dad had begun to internalize the weight of what I had carried for years, and I finally fully felt the power of self-respect and intentional absence. In that stillness, I understood a deeper truth. Life often requires acts of courage that are invisible to others. The vanishing act was not dramatic, not confrontational. It was deliberate, precise, and necessary. And in the silence, I had found a voice I hadn't known I possessed, one that did not shout or plead, but simply existed with conviction. As I prepared for sleep, whiskers curling beside me, I realized that tomorrow, when I returned home, I could approach my family with a new sense of clarity. I would no longer be the invisible host, the silent laborer, the one whose comfort was secondary to others' expectations. I would assert boundaries calmly, enforce limits respectfully, and maintain the dignity I had so often deferred to the convenience of others. And most importantly, I had learned that self-respect is not selfishness. It is the acknowledgement that your presence has value, your labor has limits, and your boundaries deserve recognition. For the first time in my life, I had experienced the profound difference between compliance and choice, between invisible labor and deliberate autonomy. In the soft glow of the motel room, I allowed myself to rest fully, knowing that the lessons of this day would echo far beyond Christmas, far beyond the temporary storm of relatives. I had discovered the strength of silence, the potency of self-respect, and the quiet joy of choosing my own path. Tomorrow, when I returned, I would walk into my home with confidence, knowing that the space I inhabited and the respect I commanded was finally irrevocably mine. The snow had stopped falling completely by the time I returned to my house the next day. The streets were quiet, the sun reflecting off the remnants of icy rooftops, turning the world into something brittle and beautiful. I approached the door slowly, taking a moment to breathe and feel the weight of what I had done. 30 people had arrived, a flood of noise and expectation, and yet I had chosen to step away, to reclaim a fragment of myself that had been swallowed by others for too long. The anticipation of stepping back into the space that was mine, the place I had maintained, cleaned, and loved for years, was almost intoxicating. I felt a strange mix of apprehension and calm. I had changed. Even if no one else realized it, I had been transformed by my own silence. Inside, the house was still organized, surprisingly so. The chaos had not been catastrophic, but the subtle tensions, the little frictions, the unspoken frustrations, those were all present, tangible, and instructive. I could see Dad's posture had shifted. He moved slower, more deliberately, consulting rather than commanding. Aunt Martha was quieter, less critical, perhaps sensing the weight of responsibility that had always fallen onto my shoulders. Even the cousins, who usually complained incessantly, had found ways to negotiate and cooperate without my intervention. The house was alive with the energy of people learning to manage themselves, a lesson in independence that my absence had made unavoidable. I set down my bag, feeling the solid, familiar floor beneath my feet, and I realized how long I had carried invisible burdens, how many holidays I had endured, performing a role that left me unseen. I remembered each small compromise, each unacknowledged effort, and I allowed myself a quiet sense of triumph, not in a bitter way, but in recognition that I had claimed agency over my life. I had shown, in a subtle but profound manner, that my time, energy, and mental space were not infinite, and that asserting boundaries was not betrayal. It was self-respect. As I moved through the house, I allowed my eyes to rest on small details. The ornaments I had carefully hung, the cushions rearranged just as I had left them, the little snacks I had prepped. These details were mine. Reminders that even in absence, I had left a mark, one of deliberate care and thoughtful structure, not blind obedience. I realized that this was the essence of balance, contribution without self-erasure. I could love, I could nurture, I could host, but not at the cost of losing myself entirely. Later, when Dad came to me quietly, his voice softer, eyes tired but sincere, he said something that would linger in my heart. "Cassidy, I didn't realize how much I depended on you, and how often I take your effort for granted. Thank you for showing me, even if it was the hard way." I nodded, feeling the warmth of acknowledgement without needing to offer excuses or apologies. It was a turning point, not just in our relationship, but in my understanding of my own worth. That night, as I sat alone by the glowing Christmas tree, whiskers curled at my feet, I allowed myself to reflect fully. I had learned that silence can carry power, that stepping back can teach more than constant engagement, and that self-respect is not negotiable. It is essential. The lesson was simple, yet profound. My presence has value, my choices have weight, and I am no longer invisible. I had navigated the storm, claimed my boundaries, and discovered the quiet, transformative strength that comes from asserting oneself with courage and clarity. And for the first time in years, I felt a peace that was entirely my own, a Christmas memory I would carry not as a burden, but as a testament to the power of self-respect, resilience, and personal freedom.